The last time the Soviet Union set off a nuclear device was in 1990. The probability that Russia sets off another nuclear weapon is the highest it has been since that time. And in order to explain why, we need to do a deep dive analysis of the current situation from the micro level, broadening our way out to the global geostrategic balance between the United States and Russia and the signaling that is going on between Washington and Moscow. Well, first, let's consider where the war is at in Ukraine. It's been going now since February of 2022. That is a while for high-intensity operations in a single theatre. Estimates vary between 300,000 to 500,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded. Russia has been frozen out of the Western Hemisphere. NATO has expanded to include both Sweden and Finland. Poland has expanded her armed forces. NATO military expending has increased, and Russia continues to fight a bloody, grinding war of attrition for the sake of some flattened, war-torn real estate in Ukraine. Now, for the past 12 months, there have been times when Putin has been lively with a spring in his step. The much-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive was a failure. Russia continued to make costly incremental gains on the battlefield, and the first signs of war fatigue were making themselves apparent in the politics of the United Kingdom and the United States. But as many of you know, in June of this year, the United States took the truly momentous step of allowing US-made weapons to strike inside the borders of Russia. It is impossible, really, to overstate how significant this is. It's the first time this has been done openly with respect to a nuclear-armed power, and for older generations, it is truly unbelievable. If you were to go back to the figures like Robert S. McNamara or JFK, and told them that in 2024, an American president would be authorizing the use of its weapons in the main territory of Russia, they would have said that was simply impossible outside of general nuclear war. And as a result of this change, the last few weeks have been among the most costly for Russia of the entire war. American ordnance has just been devastating Russian staging areas on their side of the border. Now, this step does come with significant restrictions. The US has been signaling that this authorization will not apply outside the Kharkiv area. It won't apply to US platforms of the range above 70 kilometers. But this does mean that the US won't stand idly by while Russia continues to escalate its war in Ukraine, and that Washington will take steps to protect Ukrainian cities from Russian assault. So the question for Russia's elite has been, and is being debated with a surprising degree of openness, what now? How does Russia respond? Because if it doesn't do anything, it has established the precedent that Western countries can supply weapons to its allies in the East and attack Russian territory. The whole point of being a nuclear superpower is to have complete imperviousness from outside military intervention, to be so horrifying in its capacity to rain terror upon its enemies that nuclear weapons are supposed to, in terms of strategic parlance, provide that security and prevent you from being attacked from abroad. What this change has done, in effect, and I wish it had been done in North Korea, honestly, many years ago, is to show that nuclear weapons don't provide ultimate security in every instance. That adversaries can still achieve military objectives within your borders below the level of nuclear escalation. The only way for Russia to establish that being a full-spectrum nuclear-armed state with thousands of nuclear weapons at every level from low yield right through to ultra-high yield strategic warheads, that the only way to ensure that you do not get attacked with foreign weapons is to use those weapons, those nuclear arsenal. How do you do that in such a way that doesn't result in massive escalation? Now, Russia has, with one hand, been signaling its willingness to go there through a series of steps. Those steps have included withdrawing from major treaties, the most important of which is de-ratifying the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Russia had previously ratified this treaty that said under no circumstances are we going to detonate a nuclear explosive device. Well, Russia has de-ratified that treaty. Now, to be fair, the US hadn't ratified that treaty as well because it's stuck in the US Senate, has been for decades. However, the US agreed in the meantime to observe the articles of that treaty, specifically through a moratorium. The US has not detonated any nuclear weapons for decades. And Russia's decision to de-ratify the treaty clearly indicates a willingness to resume nuclear testing. Now, Russia has also, in the last few days, sent an entire flotilla of ships to its ally Cuba, and one of its most prominent and advanced nuclear-armed attack submarines is stationed in Havana. Now, Russia is saying that the nuclear weapons have been left at home, but this submarine has been parked right out front of Havana's CNN headquarters. I mean, it is really sending the message that if America continues to go down this path, Russia is willing to go to nuclear level. Now, is this true? The view has been no, because there is no way to spin Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the consequence and outcome of that to be an existential threat to the Russian state by which it would be justified in the use of nuclear weapons. That said, last year, one of Russia's most prominent nuclear thinkers, Sergei Karaganov, kicked off a national debate about the use of tactical nuclear weapons inside of Russia. Now, this is not a nobody. He is the honorary chairman of the Presidium. He is a professor of National Research University in Moscow. Now, Karaganov's thinking prior to the war reflected that of the Russian intelligentsia generally. The idea was that the West really was at war with itself. It had all these culture conflicts. It had no self-confidence. It was in a period of social, economic, and demographic decline. That the Russian state was resurging in a multipolar world order, and that if Russia invaded Ukraine, the Ukrainians themselves would likely welcome Russia's invasion and occupation because Zelensky at the time was deeply unpopular, perception of Ukraine being a corrupt country, that any sanctions against Russia would be piecemeal and temporary, and that because the West had already tolerated Russia's annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass previously, that any change to the status quo in terms of the political situation of Ukraine would not raise much ire in the West. And even if there was views in the West to take a stronger stand, they would never be able to unify in order to present a united front. Now, in all of these areas, the Russians have been proved completely wrong. Indeed, more so than that, because certain things that were unthinkable, even in the West, have transpired. The border of NATO has expanded with Russia some 1,300 kilometers, the exact opposite of what Russia intended. And one of the moments of introspection for the Russian elite has been the question, how did we get it so wrong? I mean, the Western countries were supposed to be torn apart by their internal squabbles and culture wars, that they would absolutely not want any escalation with Russia, that they wouldn't be able to unify and have a proper front to support Ukraine, and yet they have, not only for days and weeks, but for years. They've poured money and material into Ukraine. They have frozen Russia out of the Western comedy of nations. And how is this possible? And the Russian answer for this has been that the Western countries have been insufficiently afraid of Russian nuclear weapons. That in the Russian mind, nuclear weapons are still so terrifying, so existential, that it in fact helped support their war in Ukraine, because they believe, first of all, that they would not be under threat because they had a full spectrum of nuclear weapons, and also they feared NATO in part because it has nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons loom larger in the Russian psychology than it does in the Western countries today, in part because it has been decades since the end of the Cold War, and the West has moved on, but Russia in many ways has not. And so with that in mind, I'm going to read a few paragraphs from Karaganov's argument. They are truly chilling, but I do think it sums up the Russian instinct. Now, before I go on, many Russians disagree with his policy prescription here, and so far he has remained in the minority. But the underlying emotion driving this, I think, is broadly felt. The enemy must know that we are ready to deliver a preemptive strike in retaliation for all its current and past acts of aggression in order to prevent a slide into global thermonuclear war. I have said and written many times that if we correctly build a strategy of intimidation and deterrence and even use of nuclear weapons, the risk of retaliatory nuclear or any other strike on our territory can be reduced to an absolute minimum. Only a madman who, above all, hates America will have the guts to strike back in defense of Europeans, thus putting his own country at risk and sacrificing conditional Boston for conditional Poznan. Both the US and Europe know this very well, but they just prefer not to think about it. We have encouraged this thoughtlessness ourselves with our own peace-loving rhetoric. From studying the history of the American nuclear strategy, I know that after the USSR had gained the convincing ability to respond to a nuclear strike, Washington did not seriously consider, although bluffed in public, the possibility of using nuclear weapons against Soviet territory. If they ever considered such a possibility, they did so only against advancing Soviet troops in Western Europe itself. I know that Chancellors Kohl and Schmidt fled their bunkers as soon as the question of such use came up during military exercises. We must go up the deterrence escalation ladder quickly enough. Given the vector of Western development, the persistent degradation of most of its elites, each of their next calls will be even more incompetent and more ideologically charged than the previous ones. We can hardly expect more responsible and reasonable leaders to come to power there in the near future. This can happen only after a catharsis, after they have given up their ambitions. I'll leave it there. What Karaganov goes on to argue is that Russia needs to launch a preemptive tactical nuclear strike against Poland. He believes that the use of nuclear weapons in this way will terrify the West, kind of snap them out of this delusion that he thinks the West has, and make them think more about their self-preservation and where their core interests lie. That once nuclear weapons are used, yes, there'll be complaints from around the world. Yes, Russia will have to endure even more isolation and more sanctions, but that Russia's core national security interests will be taken into consideration with much greater seriousness in Western capitals. But more importantly, this was about a year ago, before the US had authorized the use of its weapons inside Russian territory. Karaganov's arguments about the use of nuclear weapons as a tool of coercion rather than just deterrence will have greater saliency going forward and reflects the actions that the Russian leadership have recently taken. To give the devil its due, we are entering a more dangerous phase. The use of American weapons inside Russia, no matter how necessary or defensive in its approach or conservative in its execution, does increase the risk. That said, the belief that nuclear weapons provide absolute deterrence against any kind of foreign intervention, even if that intervention is for the benefit of others, has been one of the pernicious aspects of nuclear deterrence over the past 80 years. Because I remember back in 2010, this was long before North Korea tested long-range thermonuclear devices, long-range missiles. It sank a South Korean warship and shelled an island, killing several civilians, and instead of supporting its ally in retaliating against North Korea, punishing North Korea's leadership for this act of war, the Obama administration sought to restrain its ally, thereby ensuring this instability would continue and create a permissive environment for North Korea to continue these acts of provocation, both against South Korea and Japan. And the same is true with Iran. Iran doesn't even have nuclear weapons yet, but the fact that it's close to building one has provided a sense of deterrence in Washington against doing things that punish the Iranian regime despite its acts of aggression, including against the United States itself in Afghanistan. Only the Israelis have been targeting the Iranian nuclear program. So there is a general feeling, a kind of norm that's been established that nuclear weapons do prevent external interference, no matter what, no matter how aggressive or pernicious or violent your regime is, you will not be overthrown by a foreign power if you have nuclear weapons. That has been the established norm. Now, while Russia will never be overthrown because its nuclear weapons really are that powerful and is a full spectrum nuclear force, it isn't an absolute cover for it to pursue military expansion aims in other countries. There does need to be an assumption of risk among Western countries to say, yes, you can intimidate us with nuclear weapons, but we won't be intimidated. Intimidation is a choice. We're not going to stand by and let you carve off other countries, including potentially NATO countries, without us doing anything about it. Yes, there is a risk of nuclear escalation. We can both go down that pathway to hell if you choose, but Russia, it is your ambition that's going to drag us there if you get there. So Karaganov has this view that the use of nuclear weapons, say against Poland, would result in the rest of the world being terrified. And again, this is one of the reasons they think they got the West wrong when it came to the war in Ukraine, because in the minds of many of Moscow's elites, the West is insufficiently afraid of Russia's nuclear weapons, and therefore a demonstration of Russia's nuclear might may be in order. So what do I think is going to happen? Well, Russia, I like to think, is not foolish enough to detonate a tactical nuclear weapon on NATO territory. That really would be a new world. And my advice, as devastating and horrifying as it would be in that situation, would be not to take a step back, not allow Russia to set the terms of achieving strategic military aims by crossing that nuclear threshold. I would expect a tit for tat. One of the great ironies of US-Russia nuclear dynamics is that even though Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons covering every possible contingency, America has proven more deterred by North Korea's nuclear arsenal or even Iran's nuclear capability than it has by Russia. And that's because the Americans have a certain faith at the elite level in Russia's rationality. For decades, the US and the Soviet Union waged this struggle of strategic competition in the Cold War, but both sides restrained where possible to avoid escalation to thermonuclear war. And America believes that this continues to this day, and yet Russia is dismayed that America no longer seems to be taking the cautious steps it used to take to avoid escalation with Russia. So Russia agitating to change the game, to shock America out of its complacency, so-called, to ensure that nuclear deterrence can be restored. And in order to do that, the only way to do that from the Russian elite point of view is to seem crazy, to seem like they are North Korea or Iran. Now that comes with a whole range of other problems, but ultimately, if the US continues to support Ukraine, allows American weapons to be used inside Russia, then it is highly probable that the Russians will take that step. Do I believe that that will result in a nuclear strike on a NATO country like Poland? No, I don't. I think that would be beyond the Rubicon and send us spiraling over the cliff. I think the Russians can act crazy, but they're not actually crazy. What will happen is the Russian government will detonate a nuclear device on its own territory. And the purpose won't be to threaten. It'll be simply a nuclear test. It'll be a high-yield test where many cameras will be involved. It will be broadcast around the world, and the purpose will be to send that Cold War chill down the spines of the average American, to remind people the true destructive power of nuclear weapons, things that have not been set off in the lifetime of many people or the living memory of most, and to remind people that these things are still around and that Russia can use them. And the idea would be, despite all the outrage of the resumption of nuclear testing, the idea would be that next time Russia does something in Eastern Europe, the spectre of nuclear apocalypse is in the forefront of the minds of American decision makers and not completely out of mind as the Russians currently perceive it to be. Now, of course, this would be frightening. However, my advice certainly and firmly would be to ignore nuclear saber rattling, continue to support Ukraine and the right of free and sovereign countries to live free of the fear of invasion. And if you don't provide that nuclear assurance, the only possible consequence will be nuclear proliferation. Other countries will seek nuclear weapons to prevent the same thing happening to them. And we could see nuclear weapons spread all across the world if the United States was seen to be intimidated by a Russian nuclear test. But yes, that is my prediction, that Russia over the next year or two will resume nuclear testing, even if they haven't announced it today. That's my view. I would love to hear yours. I would love also to be wrong about that, by the way. It's my prediction. It's what I believe from my strategic analysis to be the direction of travel. But my hope is that I'm wrong and that both sides continue to show restraint. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.